Nines noted on the night vision, and several of the sharpshooters saw as well, that they could see the paint in the dark quite easily. The body language of the bad guys was quite apparent, and the sharpshooters wasted no time in turning their heads into a shadowy mist in the night. Their rifles were silenced, covered in brush, so the flashes couldn't be seen, and it was dark outside. The bad guys had no idea what was happening. More streamed out directly into traps, which had painted them and gone. Drone Girl got her drone back and watched from the drone Nines was controlling as the bad guys dropped in the 2s and 3s. As the low-hanging fruit were taken care of early on, the sharpshooters had to be more careful. Plus, they didn't have enough ammo to do this all night. After about the first 20 or so, they'd assumed most of the wannabe leadership was removed, and mostly followers remained. Not that the followers were any better, because they weren't. They would run around and run inside and yell, completely unsure as to what was going on. They'd surely been up all day, and now they'd been up all night, panicking and losing their minds. All they knew was that every time they went outside, their faces would start burning and then explode. Eventually, after a few hours of this, the majority of the bad guys ran out of town in sheer terror. As they ran out, they encountered the final traps. They all scattered in multiple directions, leaving their weapons behind. People without paint came out in the darkness, picked up the guns, and went from house to house with some sporadic shooting following. The team silently drove away, and intel confirmed the next morning that the subdivision was clear of bad guys. Then thankfully the raiding parties simmered down a little bit. The patrols handled most of the issues within a 30-mile radius outside the coastal borders of northeast and southeast from there on. 15. Calming over the land? ? The coming months. The marauding group dwindled in size as they realized that the groups of 200 made them almost an easier target. They broke up in groups of 25 to 50 and began preying on the less defensible areas. Food got in shorter and shorter supply, where eventually the marauders' diet started needing to be changed. It wasn't long before rumors of missing animals and people began. There was no hard evidence, obviously, as there was a big stigma around the situation. The scouts kept checking around, but the small groups were hard to lock down as their patterns became more erratic. It seemed like they were poking and prodding, trying to find another stronghold outside the city-states. Some mercs had come and gone. It seemed like they might have been speaking Russian, but hadn't caused the coastal region any issues. The rumor was that they were funneling through the city-states to the north and south. The mercs might have had a base somewhere northeast, but the coastal group couldn't find it, and it didn't seem to be much of a threat anyway. There had been rumors of an irradiated area near Bremerton, but there hadn't been a word from there in some time, and the whole section near the port seemed to be quarantined. It was never a top priority, so nobody ever went to check it out. The coast group remained well insulated from the major cities, now basically city-states on the I-5 corridor. One by one, though, each of the smaller cities fell. One after another, a person from a various city or another somehow smuggled themselves to the coast. All of their stories were similar. Bands of gangs or marauders stole all their food and did horrible things, and then moved on. The rumor was nearly everyone in the southwest state had moved further east and nestled up against the Cascades to get away from the main city-state. Across the big river, the big coastal cities bridging the two states nearly immediately turned over to the bad guys. They were basically insurgents or usurpers, but nobody could ever really settle on what to call them. They changed their own name every few months, even before the collapse, so it was hard to take any naming convention seriously. They were more easily called something like regressive or anarcho-communist. They were never happy with anything. They ended up trading a constitutional republic for a totalitarian regime and seemed to be okay with it. They hadn't had a choice, as they had made a deal with their worst enemy despite themselves. There had been rumors of NATO and the UN trying to come in, only to be shooed away and used to secure trade at the major city-states. Rumor of a new currency that nobody would accept, since it wasn't based on anything. One anecdotal story kept going around as the banks all got told off, and everyone who was living in their house suddenly owned it for the time being. This was a very little comfort when your entire condo, trailer park, subdivision, or farm could get raided at a moment's notice if you didn't have an obscene amount of defensive strategy to hold up 200 people off. Some places were able to do it once or twice, but sooner or later every location fell or had to fall back. The scouts of the coastal group kept checking as far out as was relatively safe. I had plenty of fuel, and it was all stabilized, so I was trying to carve out as much of a defensive buffer zone as possible. Eventually the Puyallup tribe came online and began security coverage, a large swath of their area, which left the coast trying to connect with the mid-southwest of the state. Scouts kept getting sent out and noted that all the RV parks were empty. They were the first to go, and it was assumed they headed over to the Cascades to safety. The trailer parks were more empty than usual, with all the trailers being shot up and destroyed. Bullets easily passed through one side and the other, so they weren't defensible without a ton of steel or books or sandbags. None of them seemed to be able to wrangle everyone together to make any sort of defensive perimeter, so they easily fell. The apartments had mostly turned into miniature ghettos, with the gangs each taking over a few. They lasted a while, but then there were rumors of the animals getting some kind of disease, which then the animals went missing as food ran scarce. Then people started getting sick. The gangs tried to expand to the condos, but most of them were in the city-states and protected by the localized city-state guard. The domestic animal virus had spread from the apartments to the subdivisions, and it wasn't long before they started getting sick also. But then the animals vanished, presumably due to all the non-perishable food being consumed and no sort of summer crop being available. That didn't last long, and people were complaining to the recon team about people going missing. The problem is that even before the collapse, gun stores were already under attack by unknown factions. A stolen car would smash into the gun store. If the alarm worked at all, it'd be ages until law enforcement got mobilized enough to get to the scene due to all the other crime they would be in the process of dealing with. The guns would never show up. The robbers would never show up. And it kept happening every few months in a different city, and law enforcement would swear they weren't connected. The gun stores always had their ears to the ground, and all of them seemed to get out okay. The sporting goods stores had all got looted clean, though, as did the home improvement stores. All the lumber went first, as the insurgents loved DIY weaponry. What the scouts were able to isolate and secure was all of the food-producing plants. It wasn't a horde, of course. They were planning on redistributing as soon as the area reached a relative calm. Not in a commie style either, but either whoever could put whichever fruit or vegetable to the best use, or who had something viable for trade. The scouts got to a certain distance out, though, and noticed that all the specific things they had been on the lookout for were already gone. They'd marked all this on their maps they'd been making and realized, after stops to several plant nurseries and looted out hardware stores, they were on the edge of another like-minded group. Careful scouting was done, but no contact was able to be made. The subdivisions were checked, but the survivors had virtually nowhere to grow anything. They had a few food-producing plants in each yard at best. The further out they got, the more plants they noticed in the subdivision backyards. All combined with the chickens that could be heard, they would likely have enough food for the summer, but not enough to preserve for the winter. Usually people ate well during the summer and didn't even think about preservation unless they had someone coordinating. Rationing was never fun to think about until it was too late and everyone was cranky. When the scouts got to the areas with a few food-producing bushes here and there, that's when the domesticated animals started to pop up again. The scouts tried to leave a note with each well-established place they talked to. They were trying to establish some kind of comms, but each place they went, they were met with skepticism. The scouting team relied heavily on Drone Girl for recon so that they would be safe. Traveling on the roads was super dangerous, and it took forever to clear a road. Every time they went out, they had to time their trips and carefully remember which roads were cleared and which weren't. After a few weeks of trying to catch the marauders in between scavenging missions, they decided to take a break from it. Some of the sciencey people back at the base wanted to investigate the dog virus, they called it. The dogs would get sick and then look all horrible and start attacking people. Humans didn't seem to be able to contract it, but then again, when they found a dog had the symptoms, they were carefully disposed of. When the recon team would go out, they kept looking for dogs. They tried to bait dogs and trap dogs, and it was virtually impossible. Whereas at the beginning of the collapse, there seemed to be packs of wild dogs. There were no longer any to be found alive. And yet the virus was somehow spreading because they kept finding signs of them. The virus dogs left behind Giant holes everywhere. It seems like the dogs were always nonsensically digging.